It's a sunny morning in Ukraine. The temperature is -5 degrees, but politics continues to heat up. Will this conflict escalate into war? Will Europe be pushed into a third world war? Or will diplomacy deliver? We are in Kiev, tracking the biggest flashpoint in the world and bringing you ground reports. Hello and welcome to Gravitas Ukraine Direct. We're coming to you live from Kiev. The local time is 5:30 p.m. The temperature here is -5 degrees Celsius. My fingers and my brain and pretty much everything else is freezing, so bear with me. There is also a forecast of war clouds over Ukraine. More than 125,000 Russian troops are camping not too far away from where we are standing. We are in the capital city of Ukraine, and this is within striking distance of where the Russian troops are stationed in Belarus. It's been a very busy 24 hours here, so I'll begin this broadcast by walking you through the latest developments. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan today. The meeting took place here in Kiev. Erdogan offered to host a Ukraine-Russia summit. Now, this was not his first mediation offer. The last one clearly did not convert. So will this time be any different? We don't know yet. Another very significant meeting took place today. This was some 6,500 kilometers from where I'm standing. The location was Beijing, and the meeting was between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. How do you think it went? I'll give you a brief summary. The Putin-Xi meeting was as much about signaling as it was about drawing a strategy. Did the two talk about the ongoing Ukraine crisis? Of course they did. The details have been kept confidential, but the two sides called on Nato to quote-unquote abandon the ideological approaches of the Cold War. Right after the meeting, President Putin talked to the press. He said the Russia-China relationship was an example of quote-unquote dignified relations. This is what he said.
As for our bilateral relations, they are developing in a progressive way with a spirit of friendship and strategic partnership. They have indeed become unprecedented. It's an example of dignified relations who help to mutually develop and support mutual development.
Putin is talking about help. Right now, the biggest help he needs from China is for Beijing to put its weight behind Moscow. China has signaled favorably in this. Right after this meeting between the two presidents, Russian Foreign Minister met Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The message coming out of this meeting was pretty clear that China is standing with Russia. And why wouldn't it? China resonates with Russia. Moscow wants to control Ukraine. China wants to control Taiwan. Both share a common aspiration for expansion. They also share a common enemy, which is the West. In the city of Kiev, there is a predominant sense of tension. Not far from here, Russia and Belarus are conducting joint drills, and it's happening in the Brest region of Belarus. Russian S-400 defense systems have arrived there, as has Russia's defense minister. He is overseeing the war games. Let me show you some footage from those drills. Meanwhile, the NATO strike group is playing war games off Italy. The United States fears a false flag attack. It says Russia may be preparing a fake video. Washington says Moscow will use this video as a pretext to start a war. Russia, of course, denies this. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called the allegations quote-unquote nonsense, but the West is not ready to take any risk. It has begun deploying additional troops in Eastern Europe. 1,000 American soldiers have been sent to Romania, 1,000, 2,000 to Poland. Russia says these moves can be destructive. It has a message for Washington, and it reads, "Stop escalating tensions." That's what Russia is saying. So these were the headlines, the day's developments. There were talks, there were troop deployments, but at the end of the day, both sides are aware that a war is not desirable. So diplomatic channels have been kept open. I already told you about Erdogan's offer. Reports also say that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz could be traveling to Moscow soon. French President Emmanuel Macron will be meeting Vladimir Putin on the 7th of February. A confirmation has already come from the Kremlin about this meeting. They will discuss Moscow security demands, among other things. What is expected from these meetings? Let's put that question to our correspondents. And to discuss the situation in detail, I'm being joined by our correspondents who've been tracking the developments closely from across the world. From Moscow, we have Julia Chapman. From Brussels, we have Rosie Burchard. And joining us from Beijing today is Patrick Falk. Good evening to all of you. Patrick, I'll start with you. You're in the city where all the action happened today. President Putin of Russia was in Beijing today, and he attended the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. How do we see this visit and everything that came out of it, including the joint statement?
Moscow and Beijing have been getting closer and closer together. They've been cooperating and partnering with one another on a number of things like trade, technology, even military exercises. And the Kremlin said that President Putin was coming here and going to be signing possibly 15 deals with China. They've also been increasingly coordinated in their pushback against the West. And although China is ambivalent about the idea of Russia invading Ukraine, it has shown sympathy towards Moscow over its concerns about NATO. In a conversation that took place between U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the Chinese Foreign Minister said to Antony Blinken that those concerns had to be taken seriously. At the same time, though, this is an incredibly important event for China, and many analysts have said that the last thing China would want is for something like Russia invading Ukraine overshadowing the Winter Olympic Games.
Julia Chapman, what does today's meeting between President Putin and President Xi and the joint statement mean for Moscow's campaign here in Ukraine?
Well, certainly the support from Beijing is a welcome move for Moscow. Russia, in its campaign to exert pressure on the West, certainly doesn't have a lot of allies in that part of the world. And China and Russia have been growing closer together over the past few years. Of course, that comes after Russia annexed the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, was met with widespread sanctions by Western countries, and needed somewhere to turn for an economic partner. China was the natural answer. Although China doesn't acknowledge the annexation of Crimea, it doesn't acknowledge that Crimea is part of Russian territory, it has certainly stepped up economic and political cooperation with Russia in the years since. Now, China is urging a de-escalation of the crisis on Ukraine, but it also has backed Russia when it says that it isn't planning to invade. And we've been hearing today from the two leaders meeting in Beijing ahead of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics, really expressing a deepening of that cooperation. They said that they had coordinated their foreign policy approaches. They stood for a multipolar world. They were condemning the use of sanctions and trade wars. They condemned the use of human rights as leverage on other countries. So certainly there are many areas where there is overlap between Russia's interests and China's interests. And while President Putin may not be getting overt support for any kind of invasion, undoubtedly he will be looking to Beijing for a sympathetic ear, at least on the security guarantees.
European leaders are making a beeline for Moscow, first Macron and then Olaf Scholz of Germany. What are the chances of diplomacy delivering after the kind of threats we saw of sanctions and, of course, the growing troop deployments from both sides?
It is difficult to see how these meetings can resolve the ongoing tensions. They are now part of several weeks of diplomacy between Russia and the West aimed at de-escalating the situation over Ukraine. Of course, Emmanuel Macron has held 3 phone calls with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the past week alone. He's now going to come to Moscow for a visit to meet in person with President Putin. He believes that he can have some impact. Of course, France and Germany were both involved in the Normandy format. They helped bring about the Minsk agreements, which were the way that Russia and Ukraine agreed to resolve the crisis, the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine between the Ukrainian military and Russian-backed separatists. That agreement has since fallen apart, but undoubtedly France and Germany do play a role in getting Russia back to the table.
Rosie, Russia and China have closed ranks and they've declared NATO and allies as a threat to regional peace. How does the West view today's developments in Beijing?
Well, you can imagine that here in Brussels, this announcement of this new kind of partnership or a joint strategy is not particularly welcome. Now, it has to be said, NATO is being tight-lipped on this. I asked them for a reaction, and they said they had no particular comment, but they did point me towards the past statements of the Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, in which he basically reiterated that position we've heard many times before, that NATO will never bar Ukraine from joining the alliance. Now, Ukraine is not currently a member of the alliance. That means that it doesn't, it's not party to the alliance's collective defence agreements. And beyond that, here in Brussels, tensions are really rising on all fronts. In the building behind me, the European Commission, it's President Ursula von der Leyen. We heard from her this morning some suggestions of what these massive sanctions the bloc has been threatening to slap on Moscow in the case of an invasion might entail. Now, in a newspaper interview, she alluded to export bans, and she also mentioned Nord Stream 2, so that controversial gas pipeline, which, if certified, would funnel gas from Russia into Germany. So tensions rising on all fronts, and we can imagine, as I mentioned, not particularly welcome news here in Brussels.
How does NATO see Turkey's role and the offer of mediation?
Well, it is interesting. Turkey has been sometimes, its role in NATO has been questioned, but here it's true that this might have an interesting role to play going forward. It must be said that NATO is intending to try and keep up the diplomacy. You know, despite this announcement today, NATO does have those offers that it's made to Russia of having a series of NATO-Russia councils around the table with all 30 NATO allies, including Turkey. That offer still stands, and as do its proposals on how to find some common ground. So in tricky areas like arms control, and even when it comes to joint military exercises. So moving forward, NATO will really be drawing on the expertise of all its allies, and will be trying to invite Russia to sit down at the table and find a diplomatic solution, a way forward and a way to de-escalate.
Patrick, Rosie and Julia, thanks very much for joining us with those updates.